When we first started this 5 years ago, we didn't know what it would end up becoming. We had no idea that literally thousands of people would come every year to come to an AgileCamp. It was really just a bunch of Agilists who were kind of frustrated over the fact that we didn't have a great conference in Silicon Valley about Agile. Not at that time. Something where we get some keynotes and be able to network and really sit down and talk with some people who had great experiences, things that are pragmatic, and share those experiences through a workshop. And so when we're doing this brainstorming, one of the people that we were able to pull in and recruit, Jen Bennett, who at the time was with Cisco, said, it'd be great if you could come in, and what would you share? And she had a passion for InnovationGames. In fact, you're like an InnovationGames facilitator too, right? After all these years, Jen has really contributed to AgileCamp, being a partner of ours. And through the years, as she's transitioned from Cisco to GE to now Google, we're really excited to be able to see what she's experienced and really pull from her learnings and really to have let's just see what inspires Jen. One of the things that does inspire me about Jen is her ability to navigate through rough waters and have vision beyond most people. She's able to see what's possible, not necessarily what's impossible. And more than that, as a woman in the Silicon Valley, she has repeatedly demonstrated her strength in being an executive in our industry. And quite frankly, it's a little tough, right? Right? And she continues to make me proud to be up here and be doing AgileCamp year after year for being part of what she's got to share with us. So with that, Jen Bennett.
Great. Boy, I don't know how I live up to that one. No, thanks. Really appreciate it. It's hard to believe, but when Stacy asked me if I would come and talk, I was really excited and thrilled and honored, actually, to be here with you guys. And even more inspired, particularly as we continue to bring more and more new people. So when he first asked the question of how many people are new to Agile, and we had a few hands raised, my challenge to you is challenge us. Always keep challenging us, because I think we tend to have a habit to get stuck in a pattern of a way of doing things, and it's good for us to continuously be challenged. And this is going to be a little bit about what I talk about today, and in brainstorming a little bit with Stacy on what he thought would be interesting to you. We started getting into a lot of conversation, and one of the conversations was really this: how do we think about agility and the difference between just surviving in this ever-changing world and thriving? And so I'm going to explore this a little bit, but let me say I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me. So my first thought was, geez, how do we define agility? And I think in this room, if I asked you to write on the board, we would come up with a dictionary, probably, of things about agility. But I went and I did a quick search, because I've studied Agile, and I could probably write down lots and lots of notes. But in fact, it's quite simple. Right? The ability to move quickly and easily, and the ability to think and understand quickly. And what struck me about this was speed. Like, it kept coming back. Speed. But in my mind, it's not always about speed. And so I started to try to think a little bit broader, and I thought to myself, okay, taking my Agile coach hat off, my Agile facilitator hat off, and taking away this simple definition, what do I think of when I think about agility? Like, if you leave this room and you go home and someone said to you, hey, what comes to mind when I say agility to you? Well, the first thing that came to my mind was dogs. I have 2 dogs, and one's a golden retriever. So this is very apropos. The first thing that came to my mind was dog agility, right? We train dogs. And I thought, wow, fascinating. And I did a little bit of research from Cesar Millan. How many people know who Cesar is, right? Dog whisperer, right? And he said, agility is really great for dogs because, number one, it goes to their natural instinct. So these dogs, these used to chase, would chase rabbits or rodents, and so this is part of their natural instinct, is to how to move quickly to catch their prey. And so in fact, the way that we walk dogs is not really part of their natural instinct. Their instinct is to be more agile. But he also said, of course, it's good for exercise, and so we should all take a lesson learned there. But the third one was actually a little bit inspiring for me. It was talking about how agility training helps bond the dog and the human. Okay? And now in the back of my mind, I'm still thinking about agility from a perspective of enterprise agility. And I kept coming back to myself about this idea of bonding, right? And how people in an organization, part of Agile and part of agility is really creating these communities of people. And so this idea of bonding a dog and its trainer isn't too far off from what we think about when we think about that. So that was the first thing that came to my mind. Second thing that came to my mind, and you'll see why in a second, is athletes. Athletes do a lot of agility training. This happens to be the women's U.S. national team in New Zealand. But I have a son who's 8. How many people have children that play soccer? Yeah. I was chatting with a father whose son plays on my son's soccer team. He's one of the best players. Well, no, he is the best player. And so I was just asking him, what do you think about the coaching, and how do you, And he said, I think it's really great. He goes, but the one thing I really miss is at this age, 8, they're really not teaching agility. I thought, oh, interesting. And this was top of mind for him, right? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, this is something that we miss from a very young age, is this ability to react quickly. And when I talk about agility and we think about athletes, we immediately think of the physical agility. But actually, what he was talking about was physical, but also mental agility, and the ability to see a situation, react, and respond. And this is true for top athletes as well. Most teams, like the women's national team, will practice agility at least twice a week, if not more frequently. And so I've talked to some of these trainers of some of these top athletes, and I said, tell me a little bit about agility. And why do you focus so much on agility? And they said, well, the game is changing so quickly that we need players who can really adjust to the rate of change of the sport. I thought to myself, isn't this fascinating? I could replace a few words, and it would be exactly what we're talking about when we talk about agility in work, right? The rate of change is so fast that we need people who can make decisions. They're not waiting for the tablets to come down from above, but they can respond quickly. So, fascinating. Now a little bit of insight into me. For those who don't recognize, that is me there. We actually even train referees to be agile. I spent 24 years as a referee. I started with the little guys, little kids at under 6s, and was an international referee for 9 years, and then I retired and became an instructor. So I actually instruct the world's elite World Cup referees. I refereed a couple of World Cups myself. What we teach referees, and you'd probably be surprised, we train agility physically because the speed of the game is changing, and they need to be able to move and get out of the way and all these sort of things. But we teach agility in terms of how you can respond to things that are going to happen. The terms we often use are expect the unexpected. Something is going to happen that despite all of our training, we can't prepare you. What we can prepare you is how you're going to adapt in that moment in time and make a good decision. So this is something that with the world's best referees, we're constantly teaching and training agility. So that led me to believe that we need to do a little bit better job of training agility for what we do. We're not a dog. Many of us are not athletes. Certainly most of us are not referees. But what can we learn from this? What can we learn from this idea of training agility? By the way, the reason they train agility is because they've seen that this has improved performance of teams, athletic teams. So it's not just because they believe, it's actually because they've seen solid results back. But what can we learn? Well, let's give it a try. This is for you. You're going to do a little bit of participation. Okay, everyone stand up. No, just kidding. I am going to put you to work here, though. So I'll let you guys read this. It's a little bit about lateral thinking. Now, many of you may have seen some of these. If you have, you can be a little bit quiet. Once you get through it, you can share with your neighbor what you think. You know, I know when I would be put through these types of exercises, I'd be like, can you just give me the answer? That's not the point. So maybe turn to your neighbor and share what you think.
That's what I just said. Call him later.
Sounds like we've had some pretty good conversations. So, someone who hasn't actually done this particular exercise before, anyone want to share? Yeah.
I couldn't decide, so I said I'm going to get out of the car and give my space to that old lady and the old friend.
Ah, great. Anybody else? Yeah, in the back?
There you go.
Romantic night in the rain.
Yeah, we have one up here.
Okay, I stop. I call 911 and wait for ambulance. Then I get the phone number of the perfect partner. And then I drive with my friend when the ambulance is there to take care of the lady.
Great. Repeat. She said she would call 911 and have the ambulance come for the old lady, and that you would have a conversation get the number of the partners so that she can call them later, and then drive with the best friend, with the friend, lifelong friend. So the reality is there's no right answer, right? There's many different ways to solve it. I shared this with my husband, and I said, he goes, well, it's obvious. The old lady's about to die. That's the first thing. You have to take care of that first. But I think the idea here behind this is, yes, there's many ways to solve a problem, right? And just because it was stated that there was only one seat didn't mean you had to be the driver. Yeah, you could give your keys to someone. They can take, right? And you can spend the time at the bus stop with your partner, as was illustrated back in the back, right? Of course, my husband says to me, I'm not giving my keys to anybody. No, good. But what we're testing is, and what the thought process is what assumptions or what preconceptions do you bring when you're solving a problem, right? And this is very apropos for everything we do. We bring our experience, we bring our preconditioning to everything we do. And everybody has different experience. And so part of what we think about of agility is this ability to think beyond what our experience might have shared. Let's try another one. Yeah. Feel free to share some ideas with your neighbors. All right, anybody want to share their thoughts? Yeah?
The reason it started was to make the consumer happier.
Okay.
It's another perspective of the same scenario.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Just a way of inventory control.
Inventory control. Tell me more.
Maybe they just price it for different purposes, like clearance items, slow items, new items.
Okay, so they can identify inventory by the pricing scheme. Interesting. Yeah.
Or maybe they save on sales tax
Okay.
themselves.
Yeah.
Get rid of pennies.
Get rid of what? Pennies? Yeah, maybe if you have a surplus. Yeah.
One less character to print, save on ink.
Okay. One less character to print to save money. Yeah, in the back.
It's the evil 9-digit conglomerate.
Is this like 3 nines, 4 nines, 5 nines? Same idea? Yeah. So interestingly enough, the history behind this was that in doing this, they required the till to be open to issue change. And so therefore, they could prevent people from stealing. Right? Right. Fascinating, huh? Something so simple that you might not have thought about it. But we had some really great ideas, and the point is, there's lots of ways and lots of reasons and lots of approaches, and we all bring different. And so it's a great way to exercise your thinking. And I think, one of the things that I will suggest is that we don't do this often enough because we spend so much time trying to solve tactical problems. What's my burning issue of today? And I've been there, trust me. The pace of life is so fast. I was talking to Barry about this. It's so fast and we have so much to do. Who has time to exercise this part of our thinking? And yet it's really critical, as I mentioned, not just for athletes, for everything that we do. This idea of being able to think differently, choose a different perspective. So what did we learn? There's many different perspectives, and we all bring a perspective. Time, when you feel like you don't have time to think through problems and maybe you don't have the ability to collaborate, this helps too, maybe we just jump to conclusions. Your experience could be a positive. It could also be a negative in some cases. You won't see a problem from a different angle. But one thing's for sure, those of us who are curious will tend to have more time and space for doing this type of exercise. We create more time and space. So just think about these things as you think about agility and how we approach problems. How many people are familiar with the Marshmallow Challenge? Yeah? Maybe about half. So this is a practical experiment in lateral thinking. And the participants, usually people have a small team, about 18 minutes, and you can see the ingredients here, 20 sticks of raw spaghetti, 1 marshmallow, 1 yard of string, and 1 yard of tape. And then they say, great, work as a team and build the tallest tower. Go. What do you think happens? For those of you who've done this exercise, give me some insights of what you see happen. Yeah.
Some people try to lead a lot, and some people didn't listen to each other, or some people just quiet.
Yeah?
Some others from other people.
Yeah, so the comment was that there's this battle about who's going to be leading, and they spend a lot of time, and everyone's got ideas, but no one's listening to anybody. And this happens a lot. That we find that this small team, because it seems like such a simple thing, and so everybody comes with their idea of how they're going to solve it. And it's their idea, therefore, as Barry said with the CEO, it's the right idea, right? And everyone else's is wrong. So yes, this happens. What else happens? Yeah.
They spend their 16 or 15 minutes of their 18 minutes planning, and they don't prototype, and a lot of times they underestimate the weight of the marshmallow. Yes.
So the number one assumption, almost everybody in this study, this, by the way, this is done by Tom Wujek, for any of those who are interested. He's got a lot of examples of this. The number one assumption is that marshmallows are light, because in general they are light, right? Light and fluffy. And so to your point, they plan everything out, and then they go to put the marshmallow on top in that last 30 seconds, and it doesn't work. And then if you thought your team dynamics were a problem, they've just become amplified by time and stress, right? And the study, he's run numbers and numbers of these. And the kindergartners do remarkably well. Remarkably well. By the way, for the record, the MBA students or graduates don't do so well. They're the ones spending a lot of time putting the plan together and idea. But the whole idea here is around what are the assumptions you're making going into it, and how often do you try to learn, iterate, right? The kindergartners immediately jump in and just start building, right? And they learn pretty quickly that this doesn't work, that doesn't work, and they want to collaborate. They want to play together. And it's somewhere between kindergarten and today where these things start to break down for us pretty significantly. And unfortunately, we don't have too many kindergartners in the enterprise. So we all have to put our kindergartner hats back on and remember that there's a lot of lessons to be learned. So yeah, if you haven't done this, it's a really fun exercise for a team, particularly if you're forming a new team. It'll show you a lot of dynamics that you have on the team. So, but a practical example of this idea of thinking laterally, but also trying, right? This whole idea of agility is try and learn, try and learn. So what do these exercises demonstrate? Well, I have a colleague of mine, Scott Jensen, who spent many years at Apple, went to Frog Design. Many of you are familiar with Frog, yeah. And then now is at Google, and he spent a lot of time in UX, but he talks about this idea of this intellectual gravity well. Let me walk you through it. We tend to use our experiences to influence how we're going to solve problems. And so the familiarity of the past we bring to future problems. And then as we go through cycles of maturity and we spend a lot of time and effort to mature something, we get stuck in this well where coming out of that well is even harder than it was to go in the first place. Okay? So we get so married to a way of doing things that we get stuck. Some people like to talk about this as risk aversion. Right? I've spent so much time to get really good at this, I'm afraid to try something new. But it's when you come out of that well when we start to see revolution. And so the quotes that I took from Scott, he said, we work so hard to mature it that we're unwilling to give up, that this is the way to do it. Like Barry mentioned with the CEO. And that he, interestingly, when he was at Frog, he said, everyone came desiring innovation. But he said, we actually were in the business of innovation therapy. Because they would create all these, they'd spend hours and hours and lots of the customer's time and money. And in the end, they would throw it all out and say, no, but not for us. Right? So they would come seeking innovation, but when they realized it meant letting go of some of the things that they held dear or that they thought they knew, it became more of a therapy session. And so he said, risk-averse people are not afraid of the future. They're just overly attached to the past. So this is something to think about. As we think about agility, having those attachments to what we know well can hold us back. I want to go through a very practical example here that he uses that I think is just it's really great. So steering. Now let's go back. Take our minds way back. Steering actually came from boating, right? And how many people here are familiar with boating? You have a tiller in the back. If you want to turn right, the tiller goes left, right? It's very counterintuitive for those of us who've been driving cars. But this is how tillers work, and it's because they're in the back. And so when the first vehicle came out, the steering was actually a tiller. And in fact, it started off in the back and then eventually moved to the front. So the very first attempt at steering in a vehicle, in a car, was actually what they knew well from boating, which was a tiller. Of course, we can probably all argue now that a tiller wasn't the best approach to steering, but it was at the time, and for a number of reasons. The roads were bumpy, so actually having more control, or what they felt like more control, was beneficial. But of course, now we know the steering wheel has evolved quite significantly from those early days. And in fact, if you look now even into the future, who knows, we probably won't have a steering wheel. Not too distant future. But this is an example where we tapped into the past, and so our first iteration on a new problem looked very similar to something we already understood pretty well. And it wasn't until a breakthrough in road conditions and in thinking about the problem differently, moving from the back to the front in terms of where we were going to do steering control, that we actually were able to get to this point of a steering wheel. We have many examples of this, but let's walk through a couple that I think we all are quite familiar with. If we look at the mobile phones, right? The very first mobile phone looked and felt like a phone that we might have used. Okay, maybe not the rotary ones that some of us might be familiar with. But certainly the touch, right? The buttons were there. And it was all menu driven. How many people remember some of these early phones, right? Yeah. And we kept iterating on that. But the design really didn't change. It was just improvements on the screen resolution and the ability to navigate menus and this sort of thing. And it wasn't really until Apple in 2008 came out with this idea of, wow, a completely different interface to how we interact. And now, look at what's happened, right? No longer is the mobile phone just a phone like we would have thought of in the beginning, and what we modeled the experience on in the beginning. It's now your social network. It's now your hub for every information gathering. It's, you play your games there. It is so central to everything we do now, right? So this idea to think differently, but you had to first go through a maturity of what you knew well, and it took someone to come out of that gravity well to try something new, right? I had to actually pull up some really old pictures. The Sony Walkman. I'm sure my son will have no idea what this is, right? This next generation. But this is where it all started. What do they call them? Personal media devices, or personal media, right? Someone probably knows. PMPs, I think they're called. But yeah, it started with cassettes. We all had cassettes, and well, how can we make them portable? Oh, we can put them in a little portable Walkman and put some headphones on, and then the medium went from tape to CD, right? And so you can see the natural progression of this. Even the early iPods were menu-driven. The classic iPod was menu-driven, right? And you had to, you remember that little round trying to navigate the menus. Again, you can see this pattern, right? And almost everything where we've had this pattern. And it really takes something, to revolutionize something really takes technology development, but also this ability to think outside that well. And so one of the things I'll challenge you to think about is, what's your intellectual gravity well, right? What are you stuck in terms of how to solve problems? But it's not just products. What about business model agility, right? Many, many examples, but I have a few here. Encyclopedia Britannica. This is a reasonably older crowd. I'm sure does everybody remember Encyclopedia Britannica? Yeah, so in 1990, they were about 600 million annually was what their revenue stream was, right? And their business model was based on expert authors and a very refined panel of editors, right? This was the model. And then Microsoft came out with Encarta. I don't know if many people remember Encarta. Yeah, some few. Okay, good. And by 1995, already Encyclopedia Britannica was down to about half, about 325 million annually. Okay, so already they were starting to chip away at this, and this was really just a digital form of a similar approach, right? So this idea of, and they had subscription model pricing, by the way, at this point. But then what happened? Wikipedia. So no longer are you relying on expert contributors, 600 million contributors in over 100 languages, and it just flourished, right? By 2012, the very last Encyclopedia Britannica was published or was sold. And now it is truly the family heirloom that it set out to be in the beginning, but for very different reasons. Right? This whole idea of crowdsourcing not only content, but correction of content. You no longer needed expert authors and expert editors. We've seen many examples of that. Another example, Blockbuster. I think we all know about this one. But in the mid-2000s, they were actually doing well, 15% growth, right? And people were still going and renting the videos. And then along came Netflix, right? And they changed the model. Similar in that you get content that's been produced, but you can get it in a new form factor. And oh, by the way, you can, just get it, use it for when you want it, no late fees, return it. I'll give you what you want when you want it, basically was their model. But they too saw disruption coming, right? They were doing streaming, but the disruption was coming, and they bifurcated their business to actually cannibalize the Blu-ray and DVD market, because they knew it was coming, and they could either choose to be part of it or be like the previous example where they were completely disrupted. And so now, right, they're doing content creation. So no longer do we have professionals creating content. Yes, they have professional studios, but we're getting much more content creation than ever before. So we've disrupted yet another market too in doing this. Business model disruption. Taxi drivers. So London taxi drivers, 3 years training, right? When you get in the taxi, do you like it when they pull out the map and try to figure out where they're going? No, we don't really trust those drivers. In fact, I believe there's some studies that show the brain of London taxi drivers is larger than, right? There's some nods here. Because of the amount of training and expertise that they had to go through. And then along came Uber. I mean, this is a great example, right? You have a phone, a GPS, maps, and a feedback mechanism that allows you to gather information so that I know how well a driver's doing and I can filter them out pretty quickly. And of course, coming soon, probably these self-driving cars, which now are going to disrupt an entertainment market too. Because, and I was watching these new ideas of what a car interior will look like. It's not going to feel and look like a car in many ways. It's going to be a whole entertainment area, right? So fascinating stuff that's happening here. But business model disruption. I have a personal example. I went to Australia this year, and you probably aren't familiar with Melways, but unless you're from Australia, Melways is the printed maps, or the business around mapping. And so my mother-in-law said, "Oh, you're going up to the city." She lives a little bit further on. She goes, "Here's the maps." She's like, I mean, this is this year. She handed me this book that was like this, right? You remember, you start navigating and you got to turn the page. Oh, page R65, like to try to find where the next. Yeah, fascinating. I said, "Yeah, no problem. It's actually on my phone. I could just put in and it'll get me there, no problem. In fact, it knows when traffic, yeah. But this whole idea of maps, printed maps, right? We went to digital format, and those still exist today. Obviously, Google has disrupted in this area, but even more importantly, in 2008, they came out with Map Creator. Why? Anybody know why? Map Maker. Sorry? I can't hear. Crowdsourcing, yeah. What happened was there were so many places in the world, particularly like India and places where there's lots and lots of people, but very difficult to get in and do all of the to actually send vehicles in to take pictures of all the street view. And so they said, well, let's just crowdsource it. And all of a sudden, maps went from covering a small percentage of the globe to almost covering everywhere in fine detail. People who lived on streets would go in and contribute to improve. So this whole idea of crowdsourcing, and this is now where I don't know if there's too many streets that aren't mapped, right? It's this idea of crowdsourcing. But one of my favorites, obviously, is Waze, and because now it's gone even beyond navigation, right? My life is in Waze's hands, I have to say. At first I was reluctant. Like, why would it take me that way on a Friday afternoon? And I was like, no, I'm going the way I know. And then I sat in traffic for 2 hours because there was an accident, right? Of course, I didn't know and Waze knew. I relinquished all control. But I actually use it because of police. This is great. Remember, who remembers radar? Who remembers radar? Why would you ever do this anymore? In fact, I don't even mind if it's wrong every now and again, because even if it catches me once, it's great. So just some examples of things where we've iterated, but we really have transformed. And so, but why is agility more important now than ever? How many people are familiar with the second half of the chessboard? Have you heard that term? Maybe not. If you haven't, Google it. No, I'm not saying that because of Google. It's just a verb. It's a verb in my vocabulary. The whole idea is supposedly when chess was created, the inventor, the emperor said, "What would you like for this? It's a great game. What would you like?" And he said, "Just one piece of rice for every square, but double it every time." Okay. So when you get to the second half of the chessboard, you can imagine what the rewards become. Quite significant. And so there's this terminology in the technology industry around the second half of the chessboard, because it's this idea of exponential growth. So if you're familiar with Moore's law and what's happening there, and now it's coming up again because of artificial intelligence. Technology is changing so fast. This is one reason why agility is even more important now than it was in the early curve of exponential growth. The early curve of exponential growth overall was relatively incremental. People, unfortunately, have a hard time adjusting to exponential growth, right? We tend to be more linear or maybe logarithmic, but exponential is something that we really have a hard time. So remember, you have a mismatch in your organization. Technology is changing faster than people are able to change or even able to conceive. And so this is what you're facing, right? This is difficult at best. And so why is agility more important now than ever? Because we can't afford not to. So when I think about this idea between thriving and surviving, I tapped into this site called Applied Buddhism. It turns out that in life, this is something that we tap into a lot in agility. But I think you can probably relate if you think about the leaders in your organization, or as Barry says, the friends who work in companies like this, right? On one side, we have this idea of fear. We have this idea of risk aversion, survival thinking. On the other side, where we thrive is where we're confident, we understand things are going to change, and we're okay with failing sometimes. Because we know overall our ability to learn will help us grow in the end, when it matters. And so this idea of having confidence, being confident about our decision making, being open, and this is the right-hand side of this thrive. And it's interesting that this comes even in our own lives. There's a book, and I actually wrote down the quote here because I wasn't sure I could remember it word for word, but Al Siebert from a book called Resiliency Advantage, and he says, highly resilient people are flexible, adapt to new circumstances quickly, and thrive in constant change. They expect to bounce back and feel confident that they will. They have a knack for creating good luck out of circumstances that others see as bad luck. So remember that. This is what agility is about. This is what the difference between thriving and surviving. Thriving is all about adaptability. So I'm going to take you quickly on a personal journey of my own. I'm going to go through this a little quickly because I want to finish on the last slide. But I started off in sports, data analytics, back in the early 90s, and we were changing how the NFL did analysis of teams. So we were using videos, streaming it, we were applying data analytics, allowing them to query. So for example, in the NFL, when they were doing analysis of a team, they could pull up like third down and short, and this personnel on the field, what's their tendency? This is back in the early 90s. We were streaming video and doing all this. Really changed. There's not a team out there now. If anybody thinks that coaches are creative in their thinking, they really are relying on data and analytics. And so I was fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time in disrupting that market, which was really fascinating for me. But the idea was, how do you think about it differently? I then moved on and we did something similar with CNN, so I was very fortunate to be part of their transformation from an analog production to digital production. I will say the one thing I learned about this is you can't assume what it's going to look like. If we were to take the mechanism of analog production and apply that to this new world, we would have had professionals out videoing whatever interview it was or going at a site. But the way that they were thinking about it was mobile phones, everybody is a news producer, right? And now you see instantaneously information is coming in to this organization and they can produce news any minute of the day, instantaneously. So it really disrupted the news production world. And what was really fascinating to me in this exercise is where I really learned user empathy. We had a little bug in our software, but there was a workaround. And like every good engineer, I said, oh, it's only a couple clicks, and there's a workaround for that. And then they said, no, come and see how it's done. Whew, we fixed that bug. Because when a news, we just so happened we came down on a day when it was a really big news day. Orders were barking out. That person didn't have time to click 2 or 3 places. And so this was a great lesson for me. I went on and really focused on collaboration and how we think about how we collaborate. And then I moved to GE, and this is a story that I really want to share with you. I went to GE because I believe that our industrial world is going to be dramatically different in the future, and I wanted to be part of that. But I want to tell you a little bit of one of my favorite stories, which is GE Lighting. GE Lighting was facing a pretty big disruption. So number one, LEDs were coming and replacing the traditional bulb. But in their professional business, they used to be a build-to-stock manufacturer, which meant that they had their parts and their things, and they would build them according to some schedule, and they'd put them in, and then people would order from that. And what they found is they had this large growing inventory because what was happening was the market was changing. So stadiums and cities were wanting more customized product. And so they had all this inventory building up. And then they realized to be more customer-centric, they actually had to change their entire manufacturing process. They had to do quite a bit of rework on that so that they were more of a custom, being able to do that. But the problem they had was their lead times were 4 to 6 weeks on anything custom. And even that they could only hit 60% of the time. So they came in and they said, we need to think about this differently. We need to add digital. We need to track things. They really transformed, and they were able to drive their lead times down to 2 weeks and 95% of the time, all through various digital initiatives, but really empowering and engaging their employees to solve the problem differently, to think differently. And they had some really great leadership that said, what do you think? What can we do differently? And so they transformed the whole customer experience, and recently they've had a news report about San Diego. San Diego was in a real crisis, budgetary-wise, but they've now transformed. And so they approached them and they said, well, actually, we can make this more cost-effective. Theyese lights will last forever. They're LEDs, all this sort of stuff. But they started to think differently, and they said, not only can these lights be less expensive overall, but actually this can now help you with better parking, because these lights now have Wi-Fi, right? They can help with law enforcement because you'd be tracking what's going on. And then they opened it up to the community and said, and what do you think we can do with these lights? So they're crowdsourcing ideas of how this intelligent lighting now could be transformational. So I love this story because this was a business, which is what GE was built on, was facing a real dire situation. And now they're really quite thriving in this new world because they were able to think differently and were able to be agile. So I leave you on this note. How many people are familiar with this? I'll go back to my athlete examples. Does anybody know who this is? Fosbury, yeah. And what I leave you on is, what if? And why not? Fosbury, for those of you who don't know, transformed how high jumping was done. And he did that because he was tall. And he couldn't improve on the traditional way of doing high jump. And he said, I have an idea. Of course, everyone at the time said, that's insane. You don't high jump like this. But of course, now it's become the de facto standard because he was so successful at it. But if you read some of his comments, it wasn't all smooth road, right? He faced a lot of challenges. And that's the point. When you're going to have to be creative, you're going to have to be innovative, and you're going to face this disruption, and you're going to be seeing technology change faster than humans can possibly change. You're going to be in enterprises where the leadership is not always supportive of what you want to do and how you want to do it. You got to keep pushing, got to keep trying, got to keep saying what if and why not. So I appreciate the time. Thank you all.